Usually when we talk about knowing something for sure, there's this underlying expectation of mechanical precision.
Right, like hard proof.
Exactly. Like if you break your arm, the X-ray clearly shows that jagged white line on the bone, right? And the doctor just points at it. There's no debate. It's binary. It's visible. And frankly, that level of diagnostic clarity is just deeply comforting.
It totally is. It gives us the illusion of control. We inherently prefer a universe that can be cleanly categorized, isolated on a slide and just viewed under a microscope.
Yeah, but the moment you step into the framework of faith, specifically the concept of trusting the unseen, well, that X-ray machine just shatters.
Oh, completely. The diagnostic clarity just vanishes.
It does. We are suddenly looking at a spiritual landscape that is undeniably murky. So today, we are wading directly into those muddy waters for you. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
And we've got a really fascinating stack of sources to go through today.
We really do. We're looking at a recent devotional text, along with some highly detailed notes from the July 2026 broadcast of the source material. And it's funny because in the notes, they actually start out by literally saying, "Welcome to Breath of Life Podcast. Today's topic, trusting God."
Yeah, they lay it right out there.
They do. And our mission today is to look way past the surface level, bumper sticker theology to examine the actual gritty mechanics of trusting God. Like, how is it neurologically and spiritually built?
And how does it survive modern catastrophic crises? Because that's the real test.
Exactly. And, why is it fundamentally different from simply having faith?
Well, that distinction between faith and trust, that is the fulcrum of this entire collection of material. The sources span everything from ancient biblical accounts to modern neurobiology, and they all converge on this one central argument. Trust is a lifelong, learned, and highly active process.
It's not passive at all.
Not at all. The Breath of Life notes actually frame this beautifully. They argue that, simply hearing a podcast or a sermon is one thing, but adding hearing and seeing and feeling it, that's a total game changer.
Yeah, internalizing it completely.
Right. And to illustrate this, the material introduces this really striking visual about how a master painter operates.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the painter analogy totally reframes the timeline of trust. The text points out that when a master painter picks up a brush to start a painting, they aren't actually starting it. They are finishing it.
It's just such a wild concept to wrap your head around.
It really is.
Yeah.
The artwork, like the complete vibrant vision, has already been entirely finished in their mind before a single drop of paint even touches the canvas. What is about to be seen on the canvas is already completed in their head.
Right. And the source material argues that this is the ultimate template for a believer. We have to learn to trust God, the ultimate artist, before God does anything that can be physically seen.
Before any paint hits the canvas of our own lives.
Exactly, because God knows that man needs to learn how to trust him. Then over time, God proves to us that we can trust him over and over again very carefully. And over time, we become like that painter. We trust God before we see anything on our canvas.
Which completely dismantles the popular everyday definition of trusting God. Because in modern terms, people usually define trust as, hoping for a favorable outcome once the situation is like halfway resolved and they can somewhat see where things are heading.
Yeah, it's a very reactive way of living. But the devotional argues that true trust is a firm, unwavering reliance on the reliability, the truth, and the ability of the Creator before the brush even moves. It's a pre-settled conviction.
Which forces us to look at the mechanical difference between faith and trust. Because culturally, let's be honest, those words are used completely interchangeably all the time.
Oh, constantly. People treat them as synonyms.
Right. But the text breaks this down using the biblical passage of Ephesians 2:8-9, and it describes faith as the root. It frames faith as a sheer gift, like an unearned impartation from God.
Whereas trust is categorized as the fruit. It is the natural consequence, the active reliance on that underlying faith.
Right, so think of it like this. If faith is like being handed the keys to a ridiculously powerful brand new car, a pure gift you didn't engineer or purchase trust is the act of actually getting behind the wheel, pulling out of the driveway, and merging onto a chaotic highway at 60 miles an hour.
That is a great way to put it, because the transition from possessing the keys to navigating the highway requires applied knowledge. Having the capacity to drive doesn't automatically grant you the skill to handle the vehicle in a blizzard.
Oh, definitely not.
The text emphasizes that trust is developmental. It has to be actively taught and practiced over time through careful, repeated exposure to God's reliability.
But I have to push back on the terminology here for a second. If trust is the natural consequence or the fruit of having faith, why is it so agonizingly difficult. Like, why do so many individuals who possess deep, genuine faith still suffer from crippling anxiety when they merge onto that highway?
Yeah, that tension is exactly what the pastor's notes address by looking at human psychology, specifically infant development.
Which was fascinating to read.
Right. Humans come into the world with a baseline of pure, unblemished trust. A newborn lacks any threat modeling or object permanence. They just simply trust everybody and everything because they literally have no data suggesting they shouldn't.
They're a blank slate.
Exactly. And the sources draw a direct parallel here to new believers. Upon an initial spiritual awakening, the devotional notes that individuals often regress to a state of spiritual infancy. Their default setting is this overwhelming joy that just assumes everyone and everything in their new environment is totally safe.
I found that psychological baseline really interesting because we know from basic developmental psychology that innocence cannot survive a complex world. Like a toddler has to be actively taught not to touch a glowing red stove or not to wander off with a stranger.
The transition from innocent vulnerability to cultured discernment is absolutely vital. The devotional frames the Holy Spirit as the guiding parent in this dynamic, actively teaching the believer not just how to trust, but specifically who to trust and who to withhold trust from.
Which is so important.
It is, because if that discernment isn't developed, the pastor's notes warn of a severe psychological backlash. Placing trust in unsafe environments inevitably leads to violation. And when trust is violated by lies or broken promises, it deeply damages our cognitive ability to trust anyone else, including God.
And this brings up an incredibly candid warning from the text regarding modern church culture itself. It argues that the modern church operates as a highly specific subculture that we are grafted into. And without us even realizing it, the sociocultural dynamics of that environment heavily warp our perception, like our basic mechanism for taking in sensory data and making sense of reality gets skewed.
Yeah, it raises a really important question about group dynamics. The text highlights this pervasive tendency within religious communities to over-spiritualize individuals.
Which creates a really dangerous echo chamber.
It does. It demands an impossible standard of behavioral perfection based on religious performance. And when individuals inevitably fracture under the weight of those impossible standards, or when they realize they simply don't fit the rigid mold of that created culture, it causes a catastrophic separation.
And the resulting disillusionment just destroys communal trust entirely.
Completely obliterates it.
So how do we navigate out of that? I mean, if our baseline perceptions are constantly being warped by the culture around us, and our neurobiology is scarred by past broken promises, how does a believer actually forge the kind of bulletproof trust the text demands? Like, how do we become the painter who trusts the blank canvas when the canvas feels actively hostile?
Well, according to the historical models provided in the sources, you don't forge that level of trust in a safe, controlled environment. You just don't. It is forged exclusively under extreme pressure.
Through the fire.
Literally. The first case study the text provides is the historical account of the 3 Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, found in the book of Daniel, chapter 3.
Right, and we really need to look past the sanitized Sunday school version of this story, because the socio-political context the sources provide makes this narrative incredibly heavy. I mean, these were young men subjected to forced assimilation by the Babylonian Empire.
They were stripped of absolutely everything.
Everything. Their homeland, their families, forced to learn a new language, and even their given names, which honored their god, were erased and replaced with names honoring Babylonian deities. It was a systematic psychological dismantling of their identity.
They were completely isolated in a hostile, totalitarian empire. And the text outlines the ultimate escalation. King Nebuchadnezzar constructs this massive gold monument and mandates universal worship upon hearing a musical cue. And the penalty for noncompliance, being thrown into a blazing furnace.
It's a supreme test of ultimate allegiance.
Yeah, and their response is total noncompliance. They flat out refuse to bow. But the source material puts this intense focus on the sensory reality of the punishment.
The narrative really emphasizes the physical extremities of the situation to highlight the stakes, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Nebuchadnezzar's rage is described in visceral terms. His facial expression visibly contorts. He orders the furnace heated 7 times hotter than standard operation.
7 times.
Right. The ambient temperature was so extreme that the thermal radiation instantly killed the highly trained soldiers tasked with throwing the bound men into the fire.
So the sensory data is screaming at them that death is completely unavoidable. Yet the core insight of this entire deep dive hinges on the precise syntax of their response to the king before the fire even touches them.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is their cognitive framing of the crisis. They state, and I'm paraphrasing here, if our God, whom we honor, can save us from a blazing furnace, he will. But if he doesn't, you should know we'll never honor your gods.
But if he doesn't, that phrasing shifts the entire paradigm.
It really is the ultimate mechanical definition of trusting character over trusting an outcome. Their trust was not contingent on their physical survival. They were fully accepting of the possibility that they might burn to ash.
Which is terrifying.
It is. But their trust was anchored in the belief that God remained sovereign and good regardless of the physical result. They entirely divorced their spiritual trust from their physical circumstances.
And the culmination of that settled trust is a profound visual. The king looks into the combustion chamber and is startled to his feet because he sees 4 men walking around completely unbound and unharmed, and he notes that the 4th figure looks like a son of the gods.
The text frames this as the artist stepping onto the canvas with them. God met them in the epicenter of the trial rather than preventing the trial from occurring.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. However, the sources pivot here to make a really crucial point. The Hebrew boys had time to settle their theology before the furnace was lit. They had a moment, to make a conscious, premeditated choice. But life doesn't always afford us that luxury.
No, it really does.
Sometimes a crisis hits with zero warning, and trust has to be learned actively, step by step, right in the middle of a sudden storm.
Which sets up the perfect transition to the New Testament case study, the Apostle Peter walking on water in Matthew 14. This narrative isolates the actual neurology of sudden panic.
Yeah, the environmental variables here are designed for maximum psychological stress.
Oh, definitely. Picture the variables for a second. It's between 3:00 in the morning, meaning the disciples are dealing with severe sleep deprivation. They are trapped in a small boat, hundreds of yards from shore, being violently pitched by sudden storm force winds on the Sea of Galilee.
In the pitch black.
Right. In the pitch black, they see a figure walking on the water toward them. Their initial cognitive processing assumes it's a ghost, and they are terrified. Jesus identifies himself, and Peter responds with a bold proposition. He says, "Lord, if it is you, order me to come to you on the water."
And Jesus issues a single command, come. The pastor's notes extract a profound relational dynamic from this exchange. Jesus had trust in Peter enough to call him onto a lethal surface because Jesus possessed complete omniscient knowledge of Peter's capacities.
But Peter's knowledge of Jesus was still fragmented.
Exactly. The text argues this wasn't a miraculous parlor trick. It was a highly targeted, custom-designed relational curriculum intended specifically to force Peter to develop real-time trust.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Peter actually executes the command. He steps out of the boat and his feet hold on the water. But the text notes, when he noticed how strong the wind was, he became afraid and started to sink. His spiritual trust catastrophically failed the exact millisecond. His brain began processing the surrounding sensory data.
It was an immediate physical override.
So I have to challenge the material here for a second. How is a human being supposed to override their own neurobiology? Like when the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, detects the lethal threat like hurricane winds, it hijacks the system. It floods the body with adrenaline and shuts down the prefrontal cortex where logic and trust are stored.
It totally takes over.
So how do we avoid sinking when our physical hardware is literally screaming at us to panic?
Well, it is the most primal, unavoidable physiological reaction. But the devotional addresses this biological override by introducing Proverbs 3.5, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In cognitive terms, our own understanding relies entirely on sensory input and historical data.
And Peter's data was telling him he was about to die.
Right. Peter's sensory data accurately informed him that liquid water cannot support human bone density and gale force winds generate lethal waves. His understanding was mathematically and logically flawless, but in that specific paradigm, it was spiritually blinding.
So the requirement for building trust is to intentionally bypass our own survival instincts and logical threat assessments.
Only by substituting it with a superior data set, specifically a proven track record. The text explains that the more an individual observes someone's historical reliability, the more the prefrontal cortex can override the amygdala's panic response.
Like exposure therapy.
Exactly. When Peter begins to drown, he shouts, "Lord, save me!" And Jesus immediately catches him. The devotional points out that while Peter failed the initial test of walking, he successfully acquired a massive data point for his trust track record.
He learned experientially that even when his neurobiology fails him and he sinks, the artist's grip is reliable enough to pull him out.
He learned the artist was still controlling the brush, even when the colors on his canvas were bleeding together.
Man, that is the exact synthesis the Breath of Life notes are driving toward. But the sources don't allow us to leave this as an ancient historical abstraction. They drag these mechanics directly into the modern crucible.
And this is where the deep dive gets incredibly heavy, but undeniably relevant.
Yeah, the text points out that contemporary believers face challenges that seem almost meticulously engineered to dismantle trust. The primary example the source highlights is the modern crisis in the medical field, specifically neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's.
The author uses Alzheimer's because it creates the ultimate theological paradox. It forces a brutal tension. I mean, you have believers who have spent decades cultivating faith, relying on scriptural promises that God will keep their minds in perfect peace.
Right.
Yet they're confronted with a pathology defined by the literal physical degradation of the brain, resulting in catastrophic memory loss, identity fragmentation, and cognitive decline.
It fundamentally attacks the mechanism of trust itself. If trust is built on remembering a track record, like we just talked about with Peter, how do you maintain trust when your hippocampus, the very organ required to store and retrieve that track record, is actively dying?
The devotional offers a harrowing but really necessary answer to that: the absolute release of control. In the face of a crushing, unseen disease that nullifies human agency, trust is redefined as holding fast to the artist's process and timing, even when it directly contradicts the medical charts and the fading sensory data.
Because the human spirit operates on a deeper architecture than the physical brain.
Precisely. And to explain the mechanics of how this kind of prolonged suffering interacts with spiritual trust, the material brings in the progression outlined in Romans 5.3-5. It isn't an overnight jump.
No, the causality in that passage is highly sequential. It states that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces confidence. Notice that suffering does not immediately yield confidence.
Right, it's a process.
Suffering merely forces the physical and psychological systems to endure. That daily grinding endurance fundamentally restructures a person's character, aggressively stripping away pride, self-reliance, and the illusion of control. Only after the character has been fully refined in that crucible does it finally generate a settled confidence or trust in God.
It operates just like a muscle fiber that has to be physically torn before it can synthesize new proteins to grow back stronger. But the sources are refreshingly honest that this is not a zen, peaceful experience. It describes this progression as a violent internal war.
Which is why the notes heavily reference the Apostle Paul's psychological struggle documented in Romans chapter 7.
Oh yeah, Paul literally writes, "What a miserable person I am." He documents this agonizing schizophrenia between his mind, which genuinely desires to align with God's standards, and his physical neurobiology, which remains captive to a corrupt, self-preserving nature.
This survival instinct we talked about.
Exactly. If we connect Paul's internal war back to our foundational analogy, it explains why trusting the artist is so perpetually exhausting. The text states that deep calls unto deep meaning, the capacity to trust the Creator, is fundamentally hardwired into the architecture of the human soul.
But that spiritual software has to constantly fight to run on broken physical hardware that demands tangible proof and absolute control over the environment.
The spirit intuitively knows the painter has already finished the masterpiece, but the flesh is staring at a blank, terrifying canvas, hyperventilating because it can't see the brushstrokes yet.
Wow, that tension is just the unavoidable reality of the human condition.
It truly is.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Let's synthesize the mechanics we've pulled from these sources today. The core thesis is that trusting God is not a passive, warm, theological comfort blanket. It is a highly aggressive, natural consequence of faith that must be hammered out on the anvil of trials.
It is a cognitive and spiritual muscle that only increases its load capacity under severe resistance.
Whether that resistance is the socio-political pressure of a literal blazing furnace, the neurological panic of a stormy sea at 3 a.m., or the agonizing slow-motion devastation of a modern medical diagnosis that threatens your very memory.
And the ultimate takeaway the devotional drives home is that trusting God, despite all that friction, universally yields positive results. It is the only mechanism capable of renewing, settling, and strengthening the human psyche for the marathon of life.
It allows you to navigate chaos with the calm, pre-settled confidence of that master painter. You can face the blank canvas of your future or the terrifying storms of your present with the conviction that the masterpiece is already completed in the mind of the creator.
When the diagnostic tools fail and the X-ray shows nothing but static, the text urges a shift in focus.
Right. You have to stop staring at the broken X-ray machine and just trust the surgeon's hands. Which leaves us with one final provocative thought to mull over before we wrap up today. The sources argue we are inherently wired to trust from birth, but we know our environments, culture, broken promises, trauma, they damage that wiring.
The world is exceptionally efficient at dismantling innocence.
It really is. So, if trust is the fruit that must be cultivated from the root of faith, and if severe trials are the precise instruments the artist uses to refine your character and build that track record, I want you to take a hard look at what you are enduring right now.
Yeah. How might the most frustrating, uncontrollable, terrifying storm in your life at this exact moment actually be the hyper-specific, custom-designed curriculum you desperately need to finally learn how to step out of the boat and walk on the water?
It's a paradigm-shifting question. You're supposed to trust the artist, not the canvas. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.
Good day. My name is Jack. I am so glad that you had time to spend with us today. The Breath of Life podcast is supported by the Let's Connect podcast. Pastor and Lady Bear Brown is excited to share with you. Trust is more than just a word or an action. God wants His children to trust Him. Earthly trust has to be developed over time. God placed trust within His creation. Instinctively, we do trust God. Our divine nature knows this truth. Our human nature fights us to accept this truth. Thank you for your time. Please like and subscribe to our channel for more of Breath of Life podcast and Let's Connect podcast. God bless and much love.